So today I'm going to talk a bit about resiliency, and I want to cover some topics that are related to resiliency. So I'm a scientist, so I'm going to marinate you with some research studies and some data to look at this topic. So first thing I need to do is to define what resiliency is, and I'm going to define it on a continuum. So when we think of a continuum with resiliency on it, we might think of fragility being on one end. So fragility is when something is stressed, it will break. And so we think of fragile packages, you can't drop it, you got to keep it dry, it has to stay upward. Any sort of stress is going to break it. And there are people or mechanisms in people that might be fragile, and therefore they might be breakable. So that's one end of the continuum. That's where we don't want to be. In the middle of the continuum is where we call resiliency. And we can think of the phoenix, and the phoenix is a mythical bird that when it dies, it burns, and then it rises from the ashes exactly the same as the way it was before. So resiliency is bouncing back to the same state where the person was before. So that's going to be the bulk of what we talk about today. I also just want to mention the other end of the spectrum, and that's anti-fragility. So anti-fragility is when something is stressed, it actually becomes stronger from that process of being stressed. And I've got here a picture of blacksmith metal, making metal or stronger, hardening metal. And so we heat metal, we pound it, and it becomes stronger because of that process. So if we can think about it, there's actually a blacksmithing curve that looks like this. So the more stress you put on something, the stronger it gets, and this is where the ultimate strength is. But if we go too far, we actually make it brittle and it will break. So this is the right amount of stress. It's not just applying as much stress as possible. This is the right dose of stress will make us stronger. So some things that we can think of with exercise, we strain our bodies, put stress on it, we become stronger because of it. When we fast, we actually change some of the biological mechanisms. We kill off cells that we kind of clean up the system. Cold exposure does some things. I'm not going to go into those topics today, but those are some things that we do when we are creating anti-fragility. And this is a topic of a book I'm working on. So let me start with the problem statement of where we're at and where we're talking about with resiliency. So we have a lot going on. We have a lot of stress in our life with the coronavirus and some other things that I'll get into. But if we think about depression and how many people are having depressive symptoms. So in this figure here, we've got 2017-18 data of where people were, and people with no depressive symptoms or not being depressed. 75% of the US population is not depressed. Currently, another study that was done in the summer, this number drops to about 50%. So 50% of people are depressed. So those are the first two columns. We went from 75% people not being depressed to 50%. So where did those people go? They moved into these categories of being depressed. So we have many more people now, 23-ish% or so being depressed, mildly depressed, compared to previously, which was below 20%. There's more people who are moderately depressed, more moderately severe, and even further, more people who are severely depressed. So it seems like something is happening with the coronavirus and our rates of depression. If we look at what it means for different races, and there is certainly an emotional toll of being black in America. I think this is a really interesting chart. We've got the amount of anxiety and depression. So this is, again, diagnosable levels of anxiety and depression. And what we see here is after the video of George Floyd's killing and the protest started, we see the spike in depression and anxiety for people who are black. So, on top of the coronavirus, there's more stress on top of that. Another chart, just I think this one even illustrates this better. This is 2019 to 2020. So first dots on the left are 2019 in the amounts of anxiety, and so we can see the prevalence of anxiety. And then in 2020, the prevalence for everybody has gone up greatly. But if one thing to note is just how much more it went up. Almost everybody's starting at around 8%. But for people who are Black, it's up to 34%, where people overall, it's everybody, it's up to 31%. So it went up even more for people who are burdened by systematic racism. And same thing with depression, a very similar chart, almost more extreme, where depression has gone up even more in specific groups. So the combination of stress and coronavirus can become even worse. So one topic I want to talk about is Psychoneuro Immunology, and this is the idea of how our psychological systems affect our immune system. And in the 1990s, there was a series of really interesting studies. The Glazers were a big part of that, and some others did some really interesting studies looking at how vaccines and how cold viruses were affected by stress. And they did some lab studies where they would bring people in, lock them in a laboratory setting for a week, and expose them to viruses and expose them to stressors or less stressors, and they would see how their immune response would be affected. So just really fascinating studies. I don't know if they could be done now, but just this idea that more stress led to a weaker immune response. This research has continued. This is something that's correlational, but looking at how cortisol levels affect mortality from coronavirus. So cortisol is a hormone related to stress, and the more cortisol you have, the more likely the person is to die from coronavirus. So this just came out over the summer. This is one of my favorite studies, just kind of showing the opposite direction. If we can control our stress, how that might affect our immune system. So this study from 2005 or 2003 from Richard Davidson's lab looked at mindfulness meditation. And what they did, they took a group of workers, and on their lunch break they had them meditate or be part of just a participation social group. And they gave them the flu vaccine, and they measured brain functioning and all of these different things and their immune response to the flu vaccine. And the group that had the mindfulness training had a much better response to the flu vaccine, had much better antibodies, and so thought to build much better immune system when they were meditating than compared to the social group. Meditation's also been mindfulness has been found to help in chemotherapy. It reduces cortisol and stress response for a group of cancer patients as well. So knowing we have some control over our response to things is important, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail later on as well. So one thing that I find that's enlightening or helpful is that we're going through this very stressful response, and the one thing that we should know is that most people are very resilient in trauma or potential trauma. So this is George Bonanno's work, and he looked at hundreds of people who were faced a trauma and just looked at how people responded to that trauma. And we often think when you're exposed to something traumatic, we immediately think of post-traumatic stress disorder and this idea that people will develop PTSD because they've been exposed to a trauma. And what he's showing in this, and others have shown in their research, is that for the most part, most people don't develop PTSD, that they just are resilient, they return back to normal. And so we can see this bottom group here, 35 to 55% of the people who just return to normal. It doesn't affect them. Many others recover. They might feel a little bit at the beginning and then just recover naturally. There's a group that has a delayed response, that they start to get more anxious over time, but that's a small group, 5 to 10% of the people. And then only 10 to 30% of the people actually develop traumatic symptoms afterwards. So for the most part, we're quite resilient in the way we deal with things. Down below I have a little reference to another study, a more modern study looking at cancer patients and just how they look after recovery 2 years down the road. And for the most part, it's very similar to this. Most people, the cancer treatment is could be a very traumatic experience. And for the most part, they are not experiencing any trauma afterwards. So let me get into a few of the mechanisms that we think of when we think of just how we deal with stress. And the first one is, and especially with coronavirus, is intolerance of uncertainty. So intolerance of uncertainty is kind of a term that describes itself. It's this idea that we just don't like not knowing. And we need to know what's going to happen. And this intolerance, uncertainty and it leaves us exhausted because we can't prepare for things, and that can lead to more anxiety. So it's thought to be a predictor of generalized anxiety disorder, which is excessive worry. It's also thought to be a maintenance factor. So people who have intolerance of uncertainty tend to have generalized anxiety disorder continue. This study from 1980 was with rats, and it's an animal study, and they do all kinds of mean things to animals, but they basically gave them shocks, and for the different groups of mice or rats, they could either go on a shock pad where they knew that the shock was coming, so there'd be a noise, they knew it would come, and it would be more frequent, or a shock pad where they would have less shocks, but they never knew when they were coming, and they would choose the one where they knew it was coming. So these lab animals consistently preferred predictable shocks. So they like to know when stress is coming, and unpredictability causes more stress, and so the anticipation of uncertain threat can be worse than the thing itself. So this idea, I can't stand not knowing, or they'd rather have the bad thing happen to them rather than just not knowing what's going to happen. And this is some interesting work by Jack Nitschke and colleagues. They've been looking at these brain circuits, and what they have found is, just this intolerance of uncertainty can actually build pathways that lead to more intolerance of uncertainty. So this idea that we're uncertain, we create more anxiety, and these pathways, sort of like a river digging deeper in and building its channels. This is what happens in the brain when we have uncertainty. So in this time of coronavirus, with all of the uncertainty, this can lead to a lot of extra stress on our life. We just don't know what's going to happen, with this disease state, with economics, with all kinds of situations. So decisions that were once trivial, when to go grocery shopping, when to visit friends, are anxious calculations that can't be fully quantified. So every decision seems to be a little bit more difficult right now. Let me talk a little bit about a history of some other things. And in the 80s and 90s, cognitive therapy was a big idea. And this idea is that our thoughts lead to our emotions. So if we say something to ourselves, we make a cognitive error, we make an assumption that I'm terrible because I made a mistake, that leads me to feel depressed. And this was Beck's model, and Albert Ellis and others came up with this cognitive model. Predominant form of therapy was cognitive behavior therapy, and this idea of changing our thoughts can change our emotions was a very big idea. And what's interesting about this was that they started to do dismantling studies of the different components of cognitive behavioral treatment. And Neil Jacobson was a CBT person, and what this group found was that just acting as if, or just the behavioral activation component, changed depression greatly and changed the thoughts in people's depression. So this idea of acting as if you're not depressed, or doing activities as if you're not depressed, is very powerful. And I want to really focus on this quite a bit. Just as powerful as changing your thoughts, and it also changes the way you think about things. So if you're depressed, you tend to have more depressive thoughts. But if you do these activities, your thoughts actually change. So you have less depressive thoughts. So just acting as if is probably one of my go-to treatments for almost everybody. Is people when they get depressed or anxious tend to restrict their life, and behavior activation is extremely powerful in changing people's thoughts and the way they look at things. So let me just kind of pause here. We've got some of the mechanism, we know the problem, and let me talk about some of the keys to resiliency. So with we started off with uncertainty, and uncertainty is it's trying to exert control on an uncontrollable situation, and that leaves us feeling even more stress. So sometimes we can fix the problem, and that's great. Sometimes being proactive is good. Sometimes managing your emotions with self-care is good. Some cases, even avoidance is something we should be doing. But doing the same thing over and over, regardless of the situation, doesn't work so well. So in uncontrollable situations, we can focus on what we can control, like our reactions, but we can't control everything. And so that's a big part of this intolerance of uncertainty, figuring out what we can control and what we can't control. I think you've all heard the saying about having the serenity, or the serenity prayer, having the serenity to accept the things you can't change, courage to change the things you can, and wisdom to know the difference. That's kind of an important thing, that coping flexibility, to figure out what you can change, what you can't change, and move on from there. So some other keys is that focusing on the present rather than thinking about the future. With the coronavirus, if you're thinking about what's going to happen next year, what's going to happen years down the way, that can be very overwhelming. So what can you do right now? What can you do right in the future? And there was just blogs of the analysis of some blogs written by parents with kids with cancer, and they found that the ones who were focused on the present did much better than the ones that were thinking about the future more. Another piece is just kind of breaking down the problem into component parts, figuring out what you can do, what you can't do. If you can't change it, you just kind of leave that one, and there'll be some uncertainty. So the final part is just accepting that unknowable outcomes, just acceptance basically, that sometimes you can't know everything, that it could have a good outcome, a bad outcome, you just don't know, and just accepting that that uncertainty is the important part. So I wanted to bring another technique and just talk about mindfulness. I think mindfulness in the research is quite powerful. We know it can change, for the earlier studies I mentioned about it, can change our immune response. There's so much good in mindfulness, but on the other hand, just from a personal perspective, I can't do mindfulness. I try and I just kind of give up on it pretty quickly, and I know all the good reasons to do it. So I think it's something that's really useful, but also people need a lot of motivation to do mindfulness training. So I put that out there as something that I think is very beneficial, but knowing that I can't do it myself, it's a big ask for people to do that. So I think if I'm going to ask people to do mindfulness, I really have to be good at my own mindfulness practice. And then we talked about behavior activation, and I break down behavior activation into 4 categories, and people break it down into different categories, but I think of pleasurable activities, which is doing things that you just enjoy. Things like, I always used going to a movie in my therapy, but going to a movie is not necessarily something that we can do right now. My mastery activities, things that make you feel like you've accomplished something, like doing chores and finishing things. Like I'd like to change the word pleasurable right now, and then I have some mastery that I misspelled a word in this slide, but I'm just going to accept that I can't change that right now. The other pieces are that are also important. So doing things that are good, are fun, just pure fun, like maybe watching Netflix, and then doing things where you feel accomplished. So those are the first 2. The next one is prosocial, and depression has been thought to be this self-focused type of disorder. So when you're depressed, you're often just focused on yourself. You're thinking about how bad you are, all the bad things, and your mood is really inwardly focused. So one of the things that's been really helpful is prosocial behaviors, getting people out of that self-focused attention, and thinking about others can be really powerful. So that's another thing that I try to prescribe people, is to go find something where you can do things for others, or write letters to others, or to help out others. So that's that third component of behavioral activation that I think is really important. And then this I find really fascinating. We know exercise is good for so many things, but this study that just came out 2 weeks ago really kind of showed a mechanism of why exercise is good. So they noticed this substance, galanin, and that it actually changed the amount, and they think this might be a mechanism why exercise helps you deal with stress better. So I've got just, again, they do things with mice and rats that are kind of mean, but they do the shock probe, and they look at freezing behavior. So if the mouse is anxious, they tend to freeze more, and with exercise they just didn't freeze as much. So they felt less stress from those shock probes, and that's from hearing a noise that usually precedes as a shock. Same thing here with grooming, that we can think of a person getting depressed, they don't want to take care of themselves, clean up anymore, but the mice that had exercised dealt better with stress and took care of themselves a little bit better. So these are well-groomed mice that exercise helped them feel less depressed. So this is just another stress response that is measured in mice.